and, in what ways they're being manipulated and why they're doing so.
Yeah, well, there's so many ways, but I just want to first say that even if you don't are not ready to look at the viruses, whether they exist issue or not, because that's a pretty fundamental issue. Like, it wasn't easy for me to come to my current conclusions, because it's so well ingrained in us that that there's germs that cause disease and they're contagious, and we've lived this our whole life. So it's the hardest thing, I think, to accept. But if you just look at like Fauci, Dr. Fauci, for example, he wrote an editorial to the New England Journal of Medicine on February 28th, said that this pandemic is akin to a seasonal flu, right? So if you trust that, right, and he knows what's going on, he's not going to say there's not a virus, but he says something like that to the medical community. But then in the White House, he tells the president, we'll keep the lockdown going another month and another month after that, and right. So he definitely knows what's going on to some degree. And if people just look at the mismatch, right, look at, well, why are they laying off healthcare workers? It doesn't make sense at all. So there's got to be something else going on to explain it. The test is extremely misleading. Okay, so the first thing I would say, there's two types of tests that are available now. There's the first test, which is primarily used, which is called a PCR, or actually RT-PCR. And what that does is measure genetic material known as RNA. And then there's an antibody test, or a number of antibody tests. And I think we've all heard of antibody tests, but we don't necessarily understand them. And the most important thing about these tests is that neither of them test for a virus. And neither of them have been compared to a test for a virus, which would be called the gold standard. So whenever you have a new diagnostic test that you develop, you need to test it against something to show how accurate it is or how much error it has. And this was something that was really stressed throughout my medical education. And they even gave an example of, for a pulmonary embolism, that the gold standard test is an angiogram where they put dye in your blood vessels and the dye can't travel beyond the blood clot. And they compared this to something called a VQ scan, which is much less invasive. You don't have to put any dye or any needles in, and but it's not nearly as accurate. So it's used, but it's not relied upon too closely. So with the tests for the COVID-19 disease, there's no gold standard for comparison at all. So there's not even a way to calculate what the error rate is. And then, as I said, it's not testing for the virus. So the PCR test is testing for genetic material that came from an impure sample, so we don't know what it is. So I know a lot of people have interpreted what I said as that the test is testing for exosomes, but that's not, I can't really say that with any certainty. It's possible that the RNA that it's testing for is from exosomes, but since they did not purify the sample that they got that sequence from, there's really no way to know exactly what its origin is. So it's a test derived for a genetic sequence from an unknown origin.
Yeah, and this is something I picked up on a while back from, I think John was one of the people writing about this as well, and the idea that essentially, and correct me if I'm wrong, that this was something that was originally from in China when this first started, and it was essentially scraped from lungs, and this was what was tested for. And as you're saying, it wasn't ultimately, and as we were talking about, it was never actually isolated based on their own standards. And so now they're testing for whatever that thing is, even though we don't, as you're saying, actually know what that thing was, and which could have been exosomes, right? Is that essentially what you were saying?
Yeah, it could have been exosomes. It could be bacteria that live in our body. It could be our own immune or lung cells. There's so many sources that it could be from. We just don't know.
Yeah, and this is the frustrating part of the trust science, trust anything kind of way we're going today, where yes, we should obviously listen to somebody who has spent their whole life working on this stuff, but we should be questioning all of these things, having skepticism, especially from mainstream anything that seems to be trying to use political endeavors to, they're more important than what's actually the truth at the end of the day. So we should be able to question these things, and yet they use these things and say, this is what it is. They stand on it going forward, and they say, if you question that, well, we're going to delete your video. We're going to remove you from YouTube. I mean, this is where we are today. And even if those people are wrong, I think we all have to admit that they have a right to question They have a right to have opinions. And even more so on top of all of that, people like yourself or the doctors in Bakersfield that were censored, they have a right to speak their mind, seeing as how they're medical professionals. And we're in a time where that's just not being allowed. And I think people
Yeah,
really need to reflect on that.
absolutely. And you know, whether you're a medical or professional or not, I mean, everybody should have their own opinion. And there's really, you know, anybody can look at this research and make their own opinion. It might require more effort. You know, like the only thing my medical training did was give me the opportunity to read a lot of papers and learn from some scientists some of these principles. But they're all well articulated out there. In fact, there's even a famous series, I think it's from a Canadian public health journal, that tells you basically how to read research papers. So you could read that series. I think it's 4 or 5 articles, and that would be a great start. And then you can start reading your own scientific papers if you want. But you don't really have to go to that link, because if you just go to the documents from the FDA, where they did not approve these tests, by the way, because to approve a diagnostic test, you have to actually have studies and compare it to a gold standard and have a known error rate in order to get a test approved, right? It's not that easy. Even though the FDA is easy overall, it's still, you know, you have to have all this data, and so it takes time. These tests were rushed to market in super fast time, and they got what's called an authorization from the FDA. And that could easily be misinterpreted as approval, but it's a totally different thing. It's only because they have declared it, you know, a public health crisis, and so now they can authorize something for emergency purposes. But if you just look at the FDA's language in there, they say straight out that they don't really know what these tests are measuring. I mean, it's right in there in plain English. You know, they say it may possibly test this, right? When that's because think about the consequences of having a positive test. You know, if you're in the hospital and you have a positive test, they're going to put you on a ventilator, right? If you're in the community and have a positive test, they might separate you from your family or require you to stay at home, you know, even more on lockdown than normal. So, and that, you know, they're going to put your name in a database as well. So there's big consequences for this test that is totally inaccurate, and we don't really know what it's measuring whatsoever.